Well, welcome. My name is Rudy Faust. I'm a senior coordinator here at the Shared Use Mobility Center. And I'd like to welcome you to our inaugural Meet the Author with Todd Litman, who we're thrilled to join us as he discusses his new book, New Mobilities, Smart Planning for Emerging Transportation Technologies, just out from Island Press, which is generously offered a discount, which we attached to the draft, which we hope you'll check out. The book was praised by our founder and former CEO, Sharon Fagan, as putting emerging new mobilities into a meaningful framework, and gives a great overview of the historic arc that got us to our auto fixation today. It includes important data and analysis to understand the potential of new modes and policies and how they can improve mobility more broadly. Written during the pandemic, it includes references to disease prevention and other issues that have arisen more recently. It also includes references to many of the key studies and findings from the leaders of the fields today. It's a terrific addition to the field. Todd Litman, who many of you might already be familiar with, is a founder and executive director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, an independent research organization dedicated to developing innovative solutions to transport problems. His work helps expand the range of impacts and options considered in transportation decision-making, improve evaluation methods, and make specialized technical concepts accessible to a larger audience. His research is used worldwide in transport planning and policy analysis. Mr. Litman has worked on numerous studies that evaluate transportation costs, benefits, and innovations. Mr. Litman has worked as a research and planning consultant for a diverse range of clients, including government agencies, professional organizations, developers, and non-government organizations. He's worked in more than 24 countries on every continent except Antarctica, and he is active in several professional organizations, including the Institute of Transportation Engineers and the Transportation Research Board. Please welcome me in virtually welcoming Todd Litman as he discusses new mobilities, smart planning for emerging transportation technologies.
Thank you, Rudy, and greetings to all my friends all over the place. I'm delighted to be here and excited to share information about my new book. So let me proceed by sharing my screen here, my slideshow. Let's see, is this? Yes, okay, well, I have to check. I actually just loaded the wrong slide, so hold on just a second. I need to go back and get the correct slideshow. I will close this one and there we go. Okay, so sorry about that. Oh, I still. Okay, well, I'm going to use this one, even though it has the wrong date. So, as mentioned, I am talking about my book, New Mobilities, and it's just come out this last month. And you can see there's a discount code that you can use if you want to order it. If what you find, if my presentation sounds interesting, you might want to buy my book. So let's start off looking back at previous transportation dreams. There was a lot of excitement. There is a lot of excitement about innovative transportation technologies and services. It's fun to look back at the old covers of Popular Mechanics or Popular Science and see how people predicted our transportation system would be now in the 21st century. And it was really exciting. Okay, so now we're going to look at our current transportation dreams. What we're predicting our future will look like. And so in my book, I review a number of innovative emerging transportation modes and services, and we're going to go through some of them in more detail in just a minute. Now, these new emerging modes and services raise a number of questions for communities. How should we evaluate them? What are their costs and benefits? Who is impacted? And who should bear the costs and risks? How should we integrate new mobilities into our transportation system? Should a particular mode or service be mandated, encouraged, regulated, or maybe forbidden? Now, I like to start off with a broad scope. And one way to frame this is in terms of sustainability. Sustainability emphasizes the integrated nature of human activities and therefore the need to balance the different, what you could call goals, economic, social, and environmental. So let me ask you, would our transportation system be sustainable if everybody drove an electric powered car? No, because electric power does not reduce traffic congestion or accidents or roadway costs or parking facility costs or the cost to consumers to purchase vehicles, or electric cars don't improve mobility for non-drivers or achieve social equity goals. They don't improve public fitness and health. They don't reduce sprawl. They don't protect threatened habitat. Electric vehicles are good, but they are, by themselves, they are not truly sustainable. The framework I use often for this kind of analysis is I identify various planning objectives, things like reducing traffic congestion and facility costs and consumer costs, and improving mobility options for non-drivers and improving safety and environmental goals. And I ask which of those does a particular transportation policy or improvement help achieve those various objectives? And you could say expanding roadway capacity, including using new technologies such as traffic signalization or, as we'll see, tunnel roads, that can help reduce maybe one or achieve one planning objective, such as reducing traffic congestion. And if we get people to drive energy efficient or alternative fueled vehicles, we're achieving maybe two planning objectives like energy conservation and reducing emissions. But if we can get people to drive less and rely more on resource efficient modes and live in more compact multimodal communities, we're achieving many planning objectives. And that's the framework that I emphasize. Now, I like to look back on in the past and look at how transportation technologies have affected our lives and communities over time. And so, one of the chapters in my book looks at previous transportation technologies and their impacts. In 1900, before automobility became common, people traveled primarily by walking. And so the average person traveled about 3 miles a day, or you could say about 1,000 kilometers a year. And over time, as automobiles became available and more affordable, our travel speeds increased and our travel distance increased by about an order of magnitude. But here's what my research identified, is that our transportation costs also increased by about an order of magnitude. So if you take into account the cost to you of owning and operating a car, the cost to your community and local businesses of providing roads and parking facilities, and even things like transit subsidies, the costs have increased very significantly. So you could say our accelerated world is actually that acceleration benefited people who had money and can afford the more expensive forms of transportation, but using what we call effective speed. So you're measuring travel speeds based, taking into account not only the time you spend traveling, but also the time you spend earning money for your transportation costs. It actually turns out that walking and bicycling, the more affordable modes, are faster than driving for people with lower than average income. In other words, the new mobilities, the new transportation technologies in the past were good for affluent people for whom owning a car required relatively few working hours, but is actually an inefficiency. It's actually slowing a lot of people down, particularly lower income people or people who, for whatever reason, can't drive and are actually made worse off. And so when we look at our emerging mobilities, I think it's important to take those kind of impacts into account. So the first mobility that I examined in my book is active transportation and micro mobilities, things like e-bikes and e-scooters. A second new mobility is vehicle sharing, so car sharing, bike sharing, scooter sharing. Another category includes taxi innovations, ride hailing, and microtransit. So microtransit generally refers to private companies that use small buses or vans to transport multiple passengers. Public transit innovations, so more convenient and efficient public transit services, more comfortable stations and vehicles and amenities like onboard internet service. These are another category of new mobilities. And then another category examined in my book and in my research includes autonomous and electric vehicles. And I'll give this a little bit more attention because this is these are the categories of new mobilities that are getting the most attention these days and are most likely to get attention when people are doing policy analysis and planning. So in my analysis, the first thing that we do is we look at how soon you'll be able to fire your chauffeur and rely on a self-driving car to take you around. The optimists predicted, say in the middle of the last decade, there were predictions starting about 2015 saying that by 2020, few people would own their own personal car because everybody would shift over to electric, autonomous shared vehicles. And that was based on experience with the telecommunications, electronic technologies that really things like digital cameras and mobile phones really did transform their markets in just a few years. It took less than a decade to shift from digital cameras to being unusual to being almost ubiquitous and almost replacing film cameras. And similarly, we can now count on most people having a digital or a smartphone. Those were transformative. But it takes much longer for vehicle technologies to transform. Vehicles are much more expensive and last much longer than most electronic devices. And very few, it's very uncommon for somebody to simply buy a whole new vehicle simply to have new technologies. People replace their vehicles every few years, or but not specifically. They won't abandon. You won't abandon operational vehicles simply to get the latest technology. And so my prediction, what I consider a realistic prediction, is that even if the technology is fully operational and becomes approved by, say, the end of this decade, say by 2027, 2028, it'll still take several years before it becomes affordable to the new vehicle purchasers, and another decade or two before autonomous vehicles become affordable to the to middle and lower income households that rely on the used vehicle market. So my predictions are that it will probably be 2040s or 2050s before autonomous vehicles are common. Now, some people predict that everybody will shift to shared vehicles, but my analysis identifies some obstacles. The images for shared taxis, robo-taxis, always show people well-dressed and happy in a clean, tidy self-driving car. But in practice, the future robo-taxis will probably be, they'll be worn down, and it'll be common that you'll enter one and there'll be some garbage or suspicious stains or odors left by previous occupants. And many people will prefer to own their own vehicles just for more convenience, so they can leave, say sports equipment or their baby seat in their existing car and won't have to move it around. So my prediction is much more cautious than some of the optimistic predictions, and it suggests that it'll be decades before most people will rely on autonomous self-driving cars. And I emphasize that these will also introduce a number of challenges to planners and policymakers. For example, many of the benefits of autonomous vehicles depend on them having dedicated lanes where those vehicles can platoon, that is, several vehicles drive close together. And so we're going to have to face questions like, at what point should highway agencies dedicate lanes to autonomous vehicles, and what should users be charged for this privilege, and how should that be enforced? And who is liable if a platoon has a multi-vehicle accident? What is the most fair and efficient use of public resources with regard to these emerging new mobilities? So let's proceed, and we'll come back to some of these issues later. But I just want to mention telework is another category of new mobilities. We're experiencing it right now, and many people have relied much more on telecommuting or e-medicine, e-shopping, all kinds of e-businesses. But it's important to recognize that even though it solves some problems, it actually creates new costs and risks, including encouraging people to live a more automobile-dependent lifestyle, a sprawled lifestyle. Some of the other emerging transportation modes include tunnel roads, pneumatic tube transport, air taxis, autonomous little airplanes that advocates or proponents predict will be able to drive you from your suburban home to your downtown workplace without being stuck in traffic. Supersonic jets, delivery drones. These are all technologies that are being proposed and to some degree being introduced into markets, and deserve to have some critical analysis. Also in my book, I look at the application of new technologies for more efficient management, transportation management, things like using efficient pricing and dedicated lanes to prioritize mobility, and new technologies to prioritize curb use and parking facility use. And also freight logistics. It's freight represents a relatively small portion of total traffic, about 10% of total traffic, but represents a very significant portion of fuel consumption, about a third of fuel consumption and pollution emissions. And there are many opportunities to use new technologies to manage freight more efficiently. So that's one of the categories of new mobilities that I examine in my book and in my research. So here are some quick conclusions about my research. One is that vehicle innovations tend to be implemented more slowly than other technological change due to the high cost, strict safety requirements, and slow fleet turnover. Automobiles typically last 50 times, or cost 50 times as much, and last about 10 times as long as personal computers and mobile phones. So we need to plan the long term. Most vehicle innovations are initially costly and imperfect. It usually takes decades before they become common in the fleet. And predictions that autonomous electric taxis will soon be cheap and ubiquitous and displace private vehicle travel are mostly made by people with a financial interest in the industry, and so should be viewed with a little bit of skepticism. There's considerable uncertainty about the benefits and costs and social equity impacts of the new mobilities. Advocates often exaggerate the net benefits by ignoring the new costs that they introduce, and factors such as the tendency of these vehicles to stimulate more driving. And so you can actually have an increase in traffic congestion and accidents and pollution emissions if we don't change our policies and implement vehicle travel reduction and sprawl reduction policies. Some new mobilities support, but others contradict our social equity goals. Many potential benefits depend on how the new mobilities are implemented and regulated and priced. And many of the most glamorous modes, like autonomous taxis and flying cars and hyperloops, many of them are actually not going to be nearly as comfortable or as useful or as fun as they're often portrayed. And total benefits tend to be greatest for the affordable, resource efficient modes. So using our technologies and policies to improve walking and bicycling and public transit often provide the greatest return on investment, while the glamorous new modes tend to be resource intensive and costly, and so provide a more narrow range of benefits. So this raises a number of policy planning issues, things like how should we deal with the tendency of electric and autonomous vehicles and ride hailing to stimulate more driving? How can we protect the interests of people who can't drive or have low incomes and want to rely more on affordable modes? How should we manage parking to take advantage of some of these efficiencies and to use parking regulations and pricing to favor more efficient transportation? And similarly, how should we price road and curb access to encourage efficiency? Just one little point is that in many situations, if parking is priced but roads are free, it'll be cheaper for somebody with an autonomous car to send that car to drive around the block continuously to avoid paying for parking. And so with current regulations, autonomous vehicles are likely to significantly increase vehicle travel and urban traffic congestion. It's going to be up to us to prevent those problems. There is some great research and advocacy going on how to deal with these. An organization called Shared Mobility Principles for Livable Cities is an example. And in my research, I've done a lot of analysis and advocacy for the innovations that I think are going to provide, to identify and promote the innovations that I think actually provide the greatest benefits to society. For more information about my work, you can buy my book, but also visit our website, vtpi.org, and you'll see there are reports that go into much more detail about everything that I shared. So that's the quick overview of my research. And I think we can now go into our discussion. So let's see. Rudy, are you going to take over?
Certainly, and feel free to either unmute and open your screen if you have a question. I am happy to surface any questions from the chat. Todd, if you would like, you can unshare your screen if you want to open up as well. I see Andrea just open her camera. Do you have a question you'd like to ask?
I apologize. Nope, I just opened my camera, but I have just really enjoyed Todd's work. Thanks for putting this book together. It's going to be a great manual for us. So congrats on the publication. And just was trying to be social in this virtual world, but I can turn it back off.
Oh, no. Feel free to leave it on too. Oh, sorry.
Rudy, how about we'll deal with Jay Lambrix's comment.
Sounds great.
Which I think is very pertinent. It's really I think the issue that we might want to explore most. And that's how can we best reach out and educate decision makers at the federal level who are mostly focused on electric vehicles as a panacea. And I would expand that it's not just at the federal level. Of course, it's at the local, regional, state, province, and federal level. And there are a couple points that I raise in my analysis. First of all, if you do a cost efficiency analysis, so you ask, what's the most cost effective way of reducing climate emissions? Vehicle electrification actually turns out to be among the least cost effective, or relatively low cost effective. The numbers I've recently seen indicate that under current policies, it's hundreds of dollars per ton. It's typically $200 to $400 per ton is what current subsidies. So when you buy an electric car, you're typically getting thousands of dollars worth of subsidy. And when you drive the electric car, you're getting another several $100s a year in subsidies in avoided roadway or fuel tax payments. And many communities are subsidizing the electric recharging station development. And that's another category of subsidy. And when you put those all together, it turns out electric vehicles are receiving, say, $200 to $400 per ton of emission reduced subsidy. Okay, that is not very cost effective. Hopefully in the future that will decline. But the other point that I think is very important is that electric vehicle subsidies are highly regressive. They directly benefit the people who buy new cars. And many of those, or at least some of them, probably would have bought the electric vehicle anyway. And with other incentives, we could encourage people to choose electric cars, not through subsidies, but by, for example, increasing the cost of driving a gasoline-powered car. The other, let's call it unintended consequence of vehicle electrification, or one of them, is that driving one of those vehicles is cheaper, and so people tend to increase their annual vehicle mileage when they shift to an electric car, what's called a rebound effect. And so there are, even if to the degree that we do encourage and subsidize electric vehicles, I think it is also important to implement vehicle travel reduction, VMT reduction policies, and smart growth sprawl reduction policies. So we're not So the benefits are not being offset by this additional vehicle travel, the rebound effect. Rudy, what do you think? Are policymakers aware of these issues, and can we design better policies?
Certainly, we could always design better policies. I think that one of the big points of your book, I found very interesting, was that you started off by like a lot of us with the confession of being a car person and the effectiveness of car culture and the inertia in that, which would seem to lead to a lot of this switch to electric vehicles is very easy for us conceptually as a culture to do. And I was wondering if, and you started looking at new mobilities as, in that sort of vein, as, as a product review, as a car culture type review. And I was wondering if you found that there was an area where you found more immediate traction that we could perhaps start by switching the conversation with that point of entry.
Sure. Let me emphasize, by the way, that I am not anti-car. I am a great supporter of a balanced transportation system. The policies that result in more efficient transportation are no more anti-car than a healthy diet is anti-food. It's all about providing the incentives so that people are encouraged to choose the most efficient mode for each trip. What is really inefficient is if we overbuild the automobile-oriented infrastructure, including, and particularly, I would say, the way we mandate parking, and so creates this huge subsidy for cars and discourages compact development. So it contradicts almost everything that we want to achieve. But I don't in any way say that everybody should give up cars altogether. But from a policy and, let's say, a political perspective, I think the key is to focus on the positives. So if we imply, or we fall into the narrative that we should take away people's cars in order to save the environment, that might resonate with 5 to 10% of the population, but it's not going to sound as good to the majority of citizens or residents. On the other hand, if you ask most people who live automobile-dependent lifestyles, compared with what you currently do, would you prefer to drive less or more, provided that we improve alternatives? Most people I know say, I would prefer to rely more on walking and bicycling and public transit, and maybe in the future shared micro taxis and things like that. If we took the resources that we're using to subsidize automobiles, we could greatly improve the alternatives. So I do think we need to take control of the narrative and paint a positive picture for an efficient multimodal community. What do you think?
I will pass it, since I see Benji De La Pena has his hand raised. I will pass it to him.
Well, just because Todd, thank you so much for joining us here for your incredible new book. But further to the point you're making, right, of how do we change this narrative? As a question, that's my question, right? It's particularly among the climate funders who are all focused on electrification. And as we've talked to them, right, they seem to, you cited earlier that the economics of electrifying vehicles as a climate change approach is actually the worst versus all the shared, encouraging multi-mobility. And yet when you go look at what the climate funders are talking about, they've gained success in changing the energy production, shifting away from coal, and now they're looking at transportation. And all the math they see is about electrifying vehicles. Right. How do we shift that narrative?
That is a great frustration. And I'm dealing with it a lot. In fact, I'm working on a new report that examines this. I mean, obviously, a good portion of it is that automobile dependency is expressed in countless ways, including it is often advocated by many of the people who are harmed most by it. The common narrative, and it's expressed in things like riots against fuel tax increases and demands for free roads and free parking and things like that. So automobile dependency is all over the place, including some of my best environmentalist friends who are so proud of their new Tesla. They think that they, often environmental policy becomes a consumer activity. So you say, I'm an environmentalist because I bought an electric car. So, okay, I get that. What really frustrates me is how frequently I see bad modeling and bad analysis that fails, for example, to take into account the very large amount of embedded energy in electric cars and the non-tailpipe pollution that they cause. And as we mentioned, the very high cost of the vehicles and the very high cost of the subsidies for them and the unfairness. So but that's the challenge that we face. Also, I should mention a lot of the modelers that I work with, the energy modelers, do not understand transportation demand management, and they don't understand smart growth at all. And so they'll often say, oh yeah, we want to improve public transit, so we'll reduce emissions in cities. And they ignore the much larger range of ways that we can increase transportation system efficiency. For example, micromodes, e-bikes and e-scooters have tremendous potential. They essentially double the number of trips that could be made by light vehicles from, in a well-designed city or urban environment, including suburbs. You could easily have 10 to 30% of trips by active modes now, by walking, bicycling now, if we fully develop their facilities and provide incentives like parking cash out. But with e-bikes, you can double that to easily 20 to 40%, and in some places up to 50% of trips many of those trips would otherwise be made by automobile. So e-bikes have this tremendous potential. And yet the modelers I talk with, their models simply don't take into account active travel. The scale is zone to zone. It's all at an automobile scale. The basic unit of measurement in most models is the vehicle, not the person. And so when we talk about 15-minute neighborhoods, or we talk about transportation demand management or smart growth, the potential benefits are not in the model. It is incredibly frustrating. So Benji, to answer your question very briefly, I would say there are many ways that many changes, many paradigms, many components of the paradigm shift from automobile dependency to multimodal efficiency. And part of that is changing the way it's presented, the narrative that is presented at a political level. And some of it is the technical, it is to improve the technical analysis and challenge some very, very bad modeling to start understanding the full potential of transportation demand management and smart growth and the role that the new mobilities can play. What do you think?
Well, just to react to that, I think part of the problem we have as transportation advocates is we land on the technicals very quickly and the policy, and we forget narrative, right? And narrative wraps and moves forward the right technical approaches. And we always land on, well, look at these numbers, or maybe we should do this policy and look at that particular mode.
Right.
And yet the larger narrative is like, well,
we need the numbers in the background, but the lead of the story needs to be painting a word picture or an illustration of a better world. We need to be able to say, and I realize this sounds funny, but our job is to create paradise on earth. And we need to have a glamorous image of what your community could look like, and not deny, not be anti-technology, but to emphasize that the technology needs to be tamed. So let's see, are there other questions?
Yes.
Or
we have
issues
one
to discuss?
Yes,
Hi, Todd. Oh,
just one from Mahoma Malhotra next, quickly, and then
Hey,
Mackenzie.
Hey, Todd, really interesting sort of insight into your book. I'm looking forward to reading it. So I had a question, actually going off of what we were just discussing with this dependency on automobiles. So I'm a graduate student at Art Center, College of Design in California, but I'm an international student. So I've come all the way from India, and I've seen that shift in how dependent we are generally as beings, especially in cities like Los Angeles, where there is so much sprawl. And you just lose that freedom of mobility so much, especially for me coming from somewhere in the global south with all these informal modes of transportation. And so my question was there that when we're talking about new mobilities, right, like your book addresses, is there some research that you were able to do or some insights that you found in that spectrum of transportation and new mobilities in the more informal modes, in the modes that maybe some of the minorities bring up through not being provided by the formal modes as well? So.
Sure. That's a great question. And let me answer it in a couple different ways. And first of all, let me say, I grew up in Los Angeles. So I grew up in a sprawled environment. And that makes me appreciate a more multimodal transportation system. And also, I want to mention that I have been lucky enough to do a lot of international work, including a lot of work for the Asian Development Bank and work in India. And I'm humbled because, you know, I'm very clearly the outsider. I can't pretend to understand all of the details in developing of the challenges in developing countries. I have a little bit of experience. I'm very proud to say that part of my work helped establish the bus rapid transit systems in Mexico City and then in South Africa. And so there are some, you know, there is a role for the international expert to come in and essentially validate the need for a new paradigm, a new approach. But, you know, let me give a couple specific examples. In a lot of developing countries, cities, the majority of travel is by motor scooters and motorcycles, especially in India. I think huge numbers, 80% of vehicles are light two-wheelers. Okay, about a decade ago, a few cities in China said, we're gonna forbid gasoline-powered motorcycles and only allow electric. And that stimulated a whole new industry. And so suddenly Chinese manufacturers were producing state-of-the-art electric scooters, and they improved the technology very rapidly. And so within just a year or two, the electric scooters became competitive with the gasoline scooters. It takes the city to mandate it, because at least until about now, so it took about 5 years before an electric scooter was actually more cost effective than a gasoline scooter. So India has the potential of following China's lead, but it's going to take the mayor or the policymakers in Indian cities and states to say, we're going to phase out gasoline powered motorcycles. You know, you're just not going to be allowed to use them. You could do some other instruments. You could price gasoline, you know, have increasing taxes or other things. The other thing I'll mention is a lot of cities have been very successful in with bus rapid transit. Bus rapid transit is by far the fastest and most cost-effective way transform urban transportation system. If you visit the Bus Rapid Transit websites, you'll see that there are now literally hundreds of BRT systems under development around the world. Again, India has been a laggard because pretty much every time a BRT system is proposed, the motorists, the wealthy motorists, organize to oppose it. And that has added years of delay. So I agree that let me emphasize, every situation is unique. Every city has its own unique needs and abilities, and so I don't tell people what they should do in developing countries. I do tell them what they can do and the benefits that would result from shifting. And we can use examples from developed countries as a warning. We can say it's unfair and unhealthy and cost inefficient, and it doesn't reduce traffic congestion to keep building urban highways. So take that money and reinvest it using in the more affordable and resource efficient modes. That's important everywhere, but particularly important in developing countries where the majority of families will never own a car. And so let's make sure that we're purely on fairness grounds. I'm making sure that every household gets their fair share of the road space, of the public space, and the investments. Let's make sure that we're prioritizing the cost-efficient, resource-efficient modes first. And we can apply that applies equally to the old technology, say pedal bicycles, and new technologies, e-bikes. What other questions do we have?
Well, did you? I believe Mackenzie.
Yes, thank you, Rudy. I had a question about the efficiency, going back to the efficiency value of electric vehicles. I definitely see what you're saying about the subsidies involved and the types of infrastructure needed for personal electric vehicle use. Could you speak to how your findings apply to things like electric school buses? And is there a significant difference in the efficiency of those modes towards climate change and mitigation when compared to electric personal vehicles, or not? Thank you.
Sure. That's a great question. And let me emphasize, I am not against electric vehicles. I am fully in favor of electrification. I would prefer that it be driven by gradually and predictably increasing gasoline or petroleum prices. So we're not having to subsidize, we're discouraging car travel, not encouraging people buying electric cars. But for urban transportation, there's almost nothing worse than a conventional diesel, heavy-duty vehicle, diesel vehicle. So the faster that we can electrify buses and trucks and other heavy-duty vehicles and get away from diesel, the better. So diesel, or let's say bus electrification is a terrific, provides a terrific return on investment, and I would highly recommend that. It's also, in an urban environment, noise pollution is almost as important an issue as air pollution, in my opinion, and it often gets overlooked. And again, diesel vehicles are terrible. Diesel heavy-duty vehicles are terrible. Anything that we can do to reduce noise and particulate pollution in urban areas is very, very important. So yeah, let's electrify buses and trucks first, and put those investments where they'll give us the best return. I mean, it is of course much more complicated. I'm not going to deny, for example, that it'll take a while before electric buses are suitable for long hauls, and there are some other little complications. But it really, you can frame it in terms of cost efficiency. Where do we get the greatest return on $1 or whatever, €1 invested? in emission reductions, and also taking into account the noise reductions. Mackenzie, what do you think?
Thank you. That's a very insightful response. And I think this is the type of nuanced discussion about technologies that often gets lost in the excitement and the shiny newness of technologies. You know, it's not necessarily that a new mobility option or an old one is bad or great. It's, is it bad or great in context? So I really appreciate you taking the time to not only talk about it today, but write it down in your papers so we can cite it in our policy development. I'm reading one of your works right now, so thank you very much. I'm sure I'll be citing you soon.
Great. What next?
I see Jay has his hand up again. Do you?
Thanks again, Todd, for answering my question. Just sorry. One thing that's been weighing on my mind actually is, well, I mean, with regards to electrifying personal vehicles, I really feel like, you know, we're fighting a losing battle. Like during the pandemic alone, the uptick in SUV and pickup truck sales pretty much wiped out everything we gained from the increasing purchases of electric vehicles. So I really feel like it's not the best tool in the toolbox, and it also doesn't. In order for it to be effective, we need to be considering the market at large. And I wanted to know if you had any thoughts on vehicle crash safety ratings and how those are judged here in the United States, because here in the US it's different. It is very different because it's based primarily on the safety of the passenger or the driver. Pedestrians are not part of the equation. The impact of the vehicle on the road, on pedestrians, on other kinds of infrastructures, very much ignored, whereas in Europe, they are forced to take pedestrians and the surroundings into account when they're designing the vehicle. So I'm just wondering if you've given any thought to that, because that's something that I think would go a long way towards maybe shifting away from SUVs and pickup trucks.
Yeah. So I take a more systematic view of traffic safety. And it's described in a report that's available free on our website called A New Traffic Safety Paradigm. And what it emphasizes is that the traditional approach has been to, like you say, to redesign electric vehicles for to have lower crash risk. But what most traffic safety experts overlook is the effect of exposure. So what I point out is, for example, some cities in the US have about 10 times the traffic fatality rate as other cities, or let's say 5 times. Seattle has about a fifth of the traffic fatality rate as in Atlanta, Georgia, per capita. Is that because the vehicles or the drivers or the roads in Atlanta are more dangerous? No, it's because people in Atlanta drive a lot more than in the low traffic fatality rate cities. And I've done this study using international data, so comparing countries and comparing cities and within cities, neighborhoods, and the results are consistent. Areas that are more automobile dependent and people drive more have higher traffic per capita traffic fatality rates. My message is that if we use an engineering solution approach and we focus on incremental improvements in what's considered vehicle safety, but overlook the amount that people drive, we will often fail to achieve our safety goal. And even if we do, we're doing nothing to achieve the other goals. Where if we identify safety as one of the benefits of vehicle travel reductions and smart growth, we provide a far better range of benefits. We're also achieving affordability and emission reductions. So this is getting back to my definition of sustainability. I would include traffic safety as one of the sustainability objectives. And so I would evaluate whether it's an old mobility or a new mobility, not based on whether it reduces risk to pedestrians as much as whether a car can crash into a pedestrian and cause less risk. Okay, that's great, but I'm more interested in reducing the chance that a car is going to crash into a pedestrian in the first place. What do you think?
Well, we certainly have started a great conversation here, and I see that we're coming up upon the hour. So I hope that everyone will continue to carry this conversation over beyond this into the networking portal on the summit. And I really appreciate getting an introduction to Todd's new book, and hopefully you'll check the chat for a link to that with the discount. And I really appreciate both the Mobility Justice Spotlight speakers earlier and Todd Litman for sharing with us. We look forward to continue the conversations next week for a week just dedicated to financial and funding systems, which we started here. So it's quite a nice segue into next week's discussions, which begin at 11 a.m. Central Time on Tuesday. I do, as these conversations that we just had were extremely relevant, I do hope that you'll carry them home with you to your agencies and communities. And thank you, Todd. If there's anything else that you'd like to leave us with, please.
Well, thank you all very much for participating. And if you do have any more questions or comments, I just posted my email address, and I'd love to continue these discussions.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone else for joining us.